It was just a raid. The Kurzaz-Kur had left almost as soon as they arrived. Just drop into orbit, hit the main population centers, and pull back again before reinforcements could arrive. They hadn't stayed more than a day. A day had been enough for what they came to do. Everyone was dead. Well, almost everyone. A few like me had managed to find some corner to hide in, or slipped through the net entirely and made it out of the town. Some had been hit and left for dead, but made it through the night. Not many, though. The aliens like to finish defeated enemies with a knife, some kind of ritual. A couple of people had survived pinned under the bodies of their families and friends. Altogether, out of the whole town of 30,000 people, a few dozen were left. Maybe 100 or two. I'm not sure the exact count, but it wasn't even enough to fill the sports hall of my school, which is where they put us. The military had also set up a bunch of screens up displaying the names of the dead, collected from the ID chips on the bodies, so we could check for our families. See if there was still hope. There wasn't. Names were added to the list as the bodies were found, so you could see who they'd been found with. My dad had been with a bunch of other men. Militia. He must have died in the trenches at the edge of town. I didn't react when I read his name because really, I'd already known. I kept scanning down the list. Shelter 6, our neighborhood's shelter, was there. I could tell from the cluster of names I recognized. Neighbors, friends, kids I'd played in the street with. But not my mother, and not my brother. They were further down. It didn't say where they were found or what had happened to them, but the names were right next to each other. I'll never know how they died. Shot down in an alley, caught in an explosion, or cornered and finished with knives. I wake up some nights, sweating, still seeing the afterimage of their deaths. Different scenario each time. Which nightmare is true, I'll never know, and that's for the best. At least I know they were together. I went back to the cot that had been set out for me, and I cried until I physically couldn't anymore. No one tried to comfort me. They all had their own misery to carry without taking on mine. A few more survivors were brought to the school, and a lot more names were added to the board. Almost everyone in the shelters had been slaughtered. They might have protected people from stray shots, but they'd done almost nothing to keep the roaches out. The ones who'd survived were the ones like me who found somewhere else to hide. After 3 days sitting on a cot eating nothing but military rations, a lieutenant came and announced that we were being shipped out. Just like that, New Montana was being abandoned. They war planners had realized what anyone with half a brain could have told them 3 years ago, that defending a small frontline colony like that was untenable. Less than 10% of the population survived the raid. In the towns, it was less than 1%. Now there was nothing left to defend. It wasn't even worth trying. They told us to go home, pack whatever we could fit in one bag. Only things you really need. I sat on the cot for a while waiting for someone to take me home, before I realized no one was going to and I'd have to take care of myself. The streets still had bloodstains, and I passed a truck piled up with corpses waiting to be taken to the mass graves they'd dug with mining excavators at the edge of town. They'd brought the power grid back online at least, so when I got in, I stripped off the t-shirt and shorts I'd spent the last week in and showered. Everything looked so normal. Everything looked like my parents had just gone to the store and would be back any moment, bringing Noah with them. But no one was coming home again. I stood in the shower just letting the water run down my back until my skin wrinkled like dried fruit. After I got out, I didn't even bother to get dressed. There didn't seem to be any point. I wandered round naked, wet hair cold against my back, pulling out drawers and cupboards at random, trying to decide which bits of my life I could afford to take with me. School art project from when I was 8, a framed photo of all of us just after Noah was born, the book my parents had given me, real paper, when I graduated from primary school. How do you make that choice? A whole life, and you can only take whatever can fit in a backpack. Easy. Leave it all. The life I'd had here was over. The roaches had killed it just as dead as everything else. I finally dried out my hair and got dressed. Then I folded 3 sets of clothes and 7 sets of underwear and crammed them in the bottom of the bag. I had a super folding coat, the kind you get in survival kits, that could be compressed down to the thickness of cardboard, so I took that too. I didn't know if we were supposed to bring food, but I threw in a few cereal bars just in case. No point in taking a phone, they'd all been fried by the EMP. Documents, birth certificate, and passport. I found the physical copies in the closet in my parents' room. I took my mother's jewelry as well, in case I needed to sell it. A few more odds and ends like tampons and a knife. After waiting a long time, I went into my brother's room. I took his blankie. I could leave my life behind, but not his. I needed something. I also took one of the family photos out of the frame, the most recent from my last birthday. When I got to the muster point, I could see they were dismantling the shield emitter and crating it up. They were taking a lot of care with it, but then it was more valuable to the military than any of the actual people. I'd say it hadn't done us much good, but if it hadn't been for the shield, the roaches would probably just have flattened us from orbit. The last I saw of New Montana was from the window of the shuttle as we reached orbit. All the way below us stretched green fields and forests. You couldn't tell a massacre had happened there at all. Then the shuttle swung round, and there was the blocky, pock-marked troop transport that was going to take me to my new life. I don't think anyone called me Leah for months after that. Whenever someone needed me, they barked Olson. The nurses in the med center giving me vaccinations, the cooks on the mess line, the harassed-looking corporal who was supposed to be in charge of making sure all the kids had someone responsible for them, and then the civilian liaison, who had me and 20 other orphans assigned to her. The less said about the refugee camps, the better. Prospero, New Phoenix, Regulus. I had my head shaved for the first time on Regulus. Lice outbreak. Apparently, even in this day and age, they can't keep the damn things down except with clippers. 6 months earlier, I would have bawled my eyes out at the sight of all my long, blonde hair being swept along the floor. By that point, I was all out of tears. Was I a good girl, who followed the camp rules and didn't get into any trouble? Was I? Fuck. The cliché for a kid like me would have been to fall in with some bad people, start hanging around a gang, get into doing dangerous things for stupid reasons. And I suppose, in a way, I did. Although I'll leave it to history to judge how stupid it was. The military were everywhere around the refugee camps. The worlds we were sent to were only a little further back from the front line. No time and no ships to take us further, and no one on Earth, or Centauri, or any other developed world who wanted us. The war had turned all the major worlds along the frontier into staging posts for the military buildup, and the military was responsible for moving us around and making sure we got fed. Another reason not to send us any further. It was simpler if the camps and the military bases shared logistics. There wasn't much for a kid to do in the camps. They tried to organize schooling, but people came and went so often it was hard to get consistent teachers, and hard to keep track of which kids were meant to be in which class. And if you didn't feel like sitting in a tent while some shell-shocked old woman tried to explain Shakespeare to you, well, it wasn't like anyone was going to bother chasing you down. Juvenile guardians came and went with the same frequency. Most of them saw me so little I doubt I was anything more than a name on a list to them. And any who did care enough to try and help, well, let's just say I didn't reward them for their efforts. Looking back, I kind of wish I'd cut them some slack. It wasn't their fault they were useless. They did the best they could with what they had. But with almost everything being fed into the war effort, what they had usually wasn't very much. So I ended up hanging out with the Marines. Why? Why does any teenage girl hang out with a bunch of young men with abs you could break rocks on? How old was I? I'd been in the camps a while by this point. Pick a number that makes you feel comfortable. And however old I was, they weren't much older. 18, 19 years old, about to be sent off to the front where the casualty lists grew by thousands every day. At the time, they seemed so mature, so confident. But I look back and all I see is a bunch of kids trying to use bravado to mask their terror. Those kids saved me. It would have been so easy for me to fall in with the gangs. There were plenty of them in the camps, running all sorts of rackets just below the radar of the authorities, more or less. Occasionally someone would get stabbed, a sweep would be done, everyone would get their tents tossed over, and a few guys would get hauled off to the stockade. Things would quieten down for a bit. Then the petty violence and extortion would resume, and nothing much changed. I could have found a place in that life easily enough, but it made a difference to me that the Marines were fighting for something, a real cause, protecting humanity, while the gangs got themselves killed over petty squabbles and greed. So I chose to hang around the military base rather than the gang dens, without knowing at the time just what an important choice that was, because they were heroes to me. I'd sit on a bunk listening with rapt attention as the one Marine in the room who'd actually seen combat embellished his stories to the hilt. Then I'd have to hide because there was an officer coming, or worse, a sergeant. Those drill sergeants were mean as fuck. They didn't care if you were a little girl. No civilians on base after dark meant no civilians on base after dark, and they'd happily give you a few bruises to remind you not to come back. More than once, me and my clothes got thrown out the front gate separately, and then I had to find my shorts in the dark while giving the middle finger to the MPs laughing at me. Didn't stop us, and I say us, because there was a big group of kids who were always hanging around the barracks. Girlfriends, boyfriends, but also kids who could pawn stuff for you, run gambling, find recreational substances. I straddled all of those lines and more. Half the economy on those bases was run by teenagers wearing military boots and camo jackets 3 sizes too big for them. The gangs would have loved to get in on that action, but the bases and their suppliers were off limits to them, and they knew it. Get between a squad of Marines and their weed, and best case scenario you'd be found in an alley missing half your teeth. Life stabilized. The government started to realize the people in the camps were never going to be resettled, at least not until the war was over. So they did what they could for them there. Tents became huts. Huts became proper buildings. They stopped moving people around so much, and communities started to form. The camp I was in got renamed from Transit Camp 331 to Concord. For the first time since New Montana, I had friends, both among the soldiers and the other kids. In fact, since I'd never exactly been Miss Popular back on New Montana, I had more friends than I'd ever had back home. Everyone on base knew me and liked me. Partly because once I finally came out of my shell, it turned out I was actually quite fun to be around, and partly because I could get things for people that they couldn't get otherwise. Having found myself unsuited to literature or history or any of the other subjects they tried to teach in the makeshift schools, I did at least get a detailed education in pharmacology and economics. The drill sergeants still gave me the stink eye, but there were enough young lieutenants around who needed to take the edge off that they couldn't keep me out for long. I had friends, I had money, and I had a community. It was maybe the happiest time of my life. And if I ever stopped to think about that I hated myself. Because it was like I was betraying everyone I'd left behind on New Montana. Friends, neighbors, people I'd grown up with my whole life until that day when the roaches came. But especially my parents, and especially Noah. I'd take out Noah's blankie, that I'd dragged all that way from camp to camp, and I'd beg him to forgive me for forgetting about him long enough to enjoy myself, and for leaving him behind that night. It got better as time went by. Guilt fades. You never forget, but at some point it loses its power to hurt you. Like a drug you're exposed to so often you develop a tolerance. And when the guilt doesn't hit so hard that you break down crying in the night, you can step back and ask yourself, is this really what they would have wanted for you? Torturing yourself over and over again over something you can't change. And that wasn't your fault anyway. If the people I'd lost hated me that much, I wouldn't have been crying over them in the first place. Finally, I started letting myself enjoy happiness. I'd found my niche and I thrived in it, and it might not have been the life my parents, or any parents, would have wanted for their daughter. But it was mine and I was happy with it. So why did I leave it? I could have coasted in that life for a while. I finally had something going my way. Instead, when I turned 18, I joined the Marines. I told people it was because I wanted to get payback against the roaches, for my colony, for my family. That was a motive people could understand, but it wasn't that. I didn't hate the roaches, except in an abstract kind of way. They were too remote, too alien. You might as well hate the weather. You think I was just a stupid kid dreaming about glory and medals and all that shit? That I didn't know what I was signing up for? I knew what war was. I saw it the night it came to New Montana. and I'd spent enough time around Marines to know what happened at the front. Not that they talked about it much, but I saw the fresh battalions go out to the front, then get rotated back 3-4 months later, with people missing, and with people who were missing something in their eyes. I knew war, in the small hours of the night when some boy who'd just finished his first tour needed someone to hold him while he sobbed. So how did I make that choice? Life or death? I signed up because the Marines gave me life. When I was a lost, angry kid, those stupid, drugged-up, immature jarheads were there for me. Maybe not always with the best of intentions, but they made sure I was fed properly and wasn't hassled by the gangs, and had some place to go where I could have fun and forget I was stuck in what was the next best thing to a prison camp. But more than anything, because they treated me like I was more than just a surname on a register. I was Leah to them, not just Olsen. When they looked at me, they saw a human being. One of them. Isn't fighting for humanity the whole reason we're in this war? I couldn't sit there watching my friends get sent to the front, knowing I could be there alongside them, and instead had chosen to keep myself safe so they could be fed into the meat grinder in my place. I couldn't do that and stay human. I didn't know if it was the sensible choice to join, but I knew it was the right choice. Besides, the draft kept getting expanded. I'd probably get called up sooner or later, but if I volunteered, I could pick the branch I was sent to. Girls mostly got put in the Navy, less heavy lifting. I wanted to make sure I was sent to the Marines. There were 4 of us girls from Concord, barracks brats who wanted to join: Erin, Yukio, Valentina, and me. I waited a few weeks after my birthday so we could all sign up together. Val didn't pass the physical, but the rest of us got shipped out to boot camp a week later. I left my mother's jewelry and my brother's blankie in a locker, with instructions for what to do with them if something happened to me. I was surprised by how much it hurt to leave them behind, but in the end, I didn't look back. When I got to boot camp, they shaved my head again. It was like saying hello to old Leah again, Leah from the bad old days. Except this time, I didn't just have to sit and take it. This time, I got to fight back. Did I say I knew what I was signing up for? I'd been dodging drill sergeants for years, and basic training was still a special kind of hell for me. Most of the guys arrived there as scrawny kids who'd never exercised in their lives, and they were still in better shape than me, Erin and Yukio would ever be. The girls had a much higher washout rate. They'd still get sent to the front eventually. The military was too short of bodies not to use everyone it had. They just wouldn't be Marines. But the washouts were mostly the conscripts. If you had the will, it could be done. There were points where I thought it would break me, but Erin and Yukio kept me going. And when they were at their limit, I kept them going. The physical demands pushed me right to the edge, but at least I was good at the other stuff. Squad tactics, weapon drill, memorizing the infantry manual. One drill sergeant said I might even have corporal potential, which from a drill sergeant is like being told you're the second coming of Jesus. Erin and Yukio didn't do so well with that kind of thing. Erin was tall enough that with her buzz cut you could mistake her for a guy. She did better at the physical stuff, including hand-to-hand combat. Yukio sucked at everything, until they put a rifle in her hands. Calm, patient, and able to stay that way even when there were explosions going off beside her. She could put a round through the bullseye every time, under any conditions. 10 weeks of basic training at boot camp, then 4 more mandatory assessment and assimilation weeks. No prizes for guessing the jokes. On base before we could be shipped to the front. They sent us back to Concord for that, to our huge relief. We slotted into the battalion as if we'd never left, except now, instead of being hangers-on, we were a full, official part of the family. Guys who'd treated us like kids now treated us like equals. And of course, the younger friends we'd had before we left, we now treated like kids. We got to show off our gear to them, including clothes that actually fit now, and our fresh tattoos, a spear through a star. Of course, since we were proper jarheads now, if any of the newbies left their still raw tattoos exposed, we'd slap it. You know, for good luck. 6 weeks after we got to Concord, our battalion was shipped out to the front.